September 5th to October 26, 1774, with 56 delegates, no delegates from Georgia, which because as our colony, before we became a state as a colony, was one of the only colonies that was directly created by Great Britain. A lot of the other colonies were created through charters given to people to operate a colony operate a colony and then become, will later when we separate from Great Britain become states. Um, and this is a very interesting dynamic where this colony of Georgia was created as a debtor colony. If you could not pay your bills, you might be banished from Great Britain to either work off those bills, or you had to come to the colonies to live and you start a new life because you weren't able to live under the British life. So if as Georgians, if some of us have a hard time with money, it might be hereditary. That might exist. But during this time, they adopted a resolution in opposition to the coercive acts or the intolerable acts. The first colonist Congress was not designed to separate from Great Britain. So we don't really want to leave Great Britain as of yet. But we are going to put into play some of the ideas that are going to be fastly stitched into the U.S. Constitution and the subsequent and the following amendments. Colonial rights to petition and assemble, First Amendment. Trial by peers, Sixth Amendment. Freedom from a standing army, Third Amendment. Representative councils to levy taxes, main body of the U.S. Constitution. So we're not just kind of casually asking for these rights. We're putting these rights into a document and saying this is what we should have. And they're so important as ideas that they're going to be foundations to what we are as America today. Unfortunately, we have to have a second Continental Congress. And the reason we have a second is we're not really hearing any resolution of the first, and we're starting to get information that Great Britain is not happy with us. We're now putting together a second meeting of the colonies because we know that soldiers are being amassed in Great Britain to be sent to the colonies. And so, meeting that convened in Philadelphia on May 10th, 1775, at which it was decided that an army should be raised and George Washington of Virginia would be commander in chief. This was a response to no change from the First Continental Congress, and actually just prior to the meeting, British soldiers land in Lexington and Concord, and we have the shots heard around the world, and we're officially in the Revolutionary War. There's a video that I love. It's narrated by Morgan Freeman, and it has many other celebrities reading different parts of the Declaration of Independence. I will try to find that video and put it into the course for you guys to see. But it lays out the Declaration of Independence. So watch that video so you can hear the Declaration of Independence. I'm not going to read through the whole document, but there are parts that we're going to discuss. So the Declaration of Independence, drafted by Thomas Jefferson in 1776, that proclaimed the right of the American colonies to be separate from Great Britain. Spurred on and pushed by Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, which brought many of the colonies together. Many of the colonies are reading this document, and it's laying out some very convincing reasons why we should separate from Great Britain and become our own colonies. The original idea, actually, though, is not Thomas Paine's. It comes from Richard Henry Lee, who lays out what he believes our government should be under a confederation. And so he argues that we should have independence, that we should form our own foreign alliances, which is what governments do. You become a nation, but if you need help, you might want to have one or two alliances in the world to assist you in doing what you need to do. We still have that today, and a preparation for a plan of confederation. We'll talk more about in chapter 3 about what a confederation is, or what the type of government that we have is at this time. And what it is the states actually have the supreme power. If you were to lay it out, if I were to draw it, the states would actually exist at the top of the relationship, and then give some responsibilities to the national government. So you'd have the states at the top, and the states would have absolute power, and they would give limited responsibility to the national government. And that's what we're going to build when we get to our first constitution. And so this is treason, which is today still punishable by death. We see in some instances that people have been charged, but we haven't had anybody formally charged and found guilty of treason lately. We've had people charged, but we haven't been found completely guilty. So, and because you can be put to death if you're found guilty of treason, even in the instances of some domestic terrorists and other individuals. That there's arguments about whether we can or we should, and we might be able to in some of those instances. But as of this point now, we haven't really charged any of those people with treason. So who was charged with writing the Declaration of Independence? Well, it's actually a committee of 5 individuals, and actually it started as a committee of 4. In the beginning, it was just Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. And the reason that we're going to end up with the 5th individual is because if you look at it, Benjamin Franklin is from Pennsylvania, John Adams is from Massachusetts, Robert Livingston is from New York, Roger Sherman is from Connecticut. They're all from northern states. And so it was decided that a Southerner was needed. Now, some of you are not going to say Virginia is the South, but during this time, if you look at the map, there's no Florida. Most of Georgia is North Georgia. And so our relationship with what is North and South was a little bit higher than it is today, but Virginia is still the South. And so what they did is they chose Thomas Jefferson, added later in order to create balance. Jefferson's addition was requested by Adams, and it was very interesting because Jefferson ends up becoming the main writer of the document, and his thoughts end up laying out a lot of what the document is when we finalize it today. On July 2nd, 1776, 12 of the 13 colonies with New York abstaining voted for independence. Some people will argue that's our true Independence Day. And on July 4th, the Second Continental Congress voted to bring the document into to existence, and that becomes our Independence Day. That's the day they signed. So the vote really actually happens on the 2nd, and the signatures happen on the 4th. And so we use the 4th of July as the date of our Independence Day. But the vote happened on the 2nd. There's some key parts of the Declaration of Independence that we want to talk about. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the freedom statement of our Declaration of Independence. It talks about how men are free. Now we're talking about men as in mankind, not men as in the male gender. I guess it's a typo, but probably when I typed it, I wasn't doing it. But that M is actually capitalized in the document. But we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, as in mankind, are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we kind of lay out what we want in a government, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. We talked about that in chapter 1. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, so if government ever decides not to listen to the consent of the governed, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute a new government. So if we don't follow the consent of the governed, it's the responsibility of the people to step up and either change the government or remake it if needed, whether being disbanding it and making a new one or whatever is necessary. And lays its foundation on the principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So we have kind of the freedom statement and our structure statement about how government is supposed to act in this nation. So we separate from Great Britain. We are now the United States of America. And we have to now think about putting into play a different understanding about what government is, because now we're forming our own government. And this is not an easy thing. We create a nation in 1776. We don't put a foundation to that nation into place until 1781. That means we're going to go 4 years. Well, actually, let's take that back. So, yeah, it's about almost 5 years yeah, almost 5 years to put a government into place. And so in those 4 years, the colonies are acting independently, kind of like their own small nations. And so to combat this 13 different countries understanding, we decide that for the benefit of these colonies, we need to band together in some instances to provide order and protection for America. And so the first Constitution of the United States, the Articles of Confederation, the compact among the 13 original colonies that created a loose league of friendships with the national government drawing its power from the states. Again, national government at the top, state government at the top with absolute power. So all the states are independent of one another. They all act as their own little countries in most things, but there are some responsibilities that they're going to give to this national government for them to have a benefit, which are going to be the ability to coin money, make peace, appoint army officers, control post offices, and negotiate with Indian tribes. That is the responsibilities that they're going to give to the national government. However, the states can still coin money, make peace, appoint army officers, control post offices, and negotiate with Indian tribes. And and because the states can keep those powers really and do them themselves, they don't really rely on the national government at this time. And there are other things in how the government is created that are going to create a little bit of problems as it lives and goes on for the next 6 years until we get to 1787. And so one vote per state, regardless of size. So no matter if you had the the largest population or the least, you had the same say. 9 states were needed to pass any measure. So if representatives from 9 states needed to be present. If we don't have representatives from 9 states, then we don't have quorum, which that means we can't have a meeting, which means we're not going to have anything done. You needed a unanimous vote to make an amendment. That means everybody has to amend the document. Everybody has to vote yes for that document. Which in my classes, I usually ask a question. I ask the class, "What's the color of the sky?" And if we have a full class and we go through the usual 30 people that are in my class, we don't usually make it to the end of the 30 people without somebody saying something other than blue. Somebody will say light blue. Somebody says, well, it's really not blue. It's a reflection of the, or whatever. And so if we can't all decide on what the color of the sky is, how are we all going to decide on a new change to a document that's going to dictate the policy of a nation? And that's a little bit more of a difficult question. And selection and payment of delegates to Congress by their representative state legislatures. Okay, so the states pay the national government figures. And because the states pay them, the national government figures listen to their state rather than work together on the national level to create a solution. If you work and you have a boss, you listen to your boss at your job because they make sure you get paid. That's a huge part of that. So let's look at the problems of the Articles of Confederation. Well, we never had presence of enough colonies to make policy, which means no amendments could be made, no new laws could be made. People really didn't feel that the national government was important, so nobody really showed up. And so we would have meetings from time to time, but for the most part, the national government couldn't do anything because it never could make any laws to do anything. The government needed to pay war debts, but it didn't give itself the ability to tax. And so it can't tax the people on income or even excise taxes, which is the tax on goods going in and coming out of the country, some tariffs that it would need to pay off its debts. And so we have these debts, but we're not paying on them because we have no means of raising the money. The national government could coin money, but it had no real value. Actually, the value of all money is very interesting. All money... I think I have my wallet right here. Yeah, so all money. So if I pull out some money, and yeah, hopefully I do. Yeah, I got some money in here. That's a $20 bill. And so what is this worth? And some of you guys are going to be like, $20. Well, no, it's worth nothing. It's worth as much as the trust that we put into it. So I believe that this is $20. I don't have any other crap. I have a 10 in here. And I believe that this 20 is worth twice as much as this 10. But they're just both pieces of paper that I have agreed are worth something of value. And so if I have no confidence that these are worth anything, they're not worth anything. We could trade in dirt if we wanted to, or leaves. If we believe that they have value, they have value. So people did not believe in the currency of the national government, and so it really had no value. People didn't want to trade in it. People didn't want to buy goods with it. The money that existed on the state level was a better currency that people trusted, and so you could buy things with that currency, and people relied on their own state currencies. The national government was weaker in foreign relations than the states. Again, states were trading with one another and making treaties with foreign nations, and no foreign nation really cared that the national government existed because the states didn't care that the national government existed. And the Articles made no provision for an executive or judicial branch, no power to handle conflicts or government conflicts between the states or other governmental disputes. If Tennessee and Georgia have an argument, and this we still have an argument today over where the line of Tennessee and Georgia are, but say that we didn't have a judicial branch to fledge out the issue between Georgia and Tennessee, well, what would happen is the militia of Tennessee would form, and the militia of Georgia would form, and we would have a war. And then whoever survives that war would dictate where the line of Georgia and Tennessee are. And that was what was happening. Many of our states were having wars with one another over territory or over issues because there's no governmental body to resolve those disputes, which is actually one of the main responsibilities of our Supreme Court of the United States today. It's one of the things that it's given the power to do is resolve disputes between states. So our representatives decide to meet for a meeting. They're going to come to Philadelphia to have at first it was just a meeting to discuss the Articles of Confederation, but we're going to know it now as history, as the Constitutional Convention. And they're here for the sole purpose of ratifying of revising the Articles of Confederation, meaning that we're going to make some changes, and that's still going to be our Constitution, but we're just going to make some little tweaks. But we're going to quickly realize that to change the Articles of Confederation, we're going to have to use the rules of the Articles of Confederation. And one of those rules is going to create a problem. And that problem is that whole unanimous vote needed to make an amendment. And so we're trying to amend this document, and people are saying, well, I want to make proportional representation a thing in our Constitution. And somebody says, well, I don't. And so that would kill that idea, because that one person saying no would kill that amendment. And some people would say, well, I want to end slavery. And some people would raise their hand and say, well, I don't. And that idea would be dead. And it eventually ended up that we're going to have to get rid of this document and start over. And they aren't really sure if they can do that, but they do. And many people can argue that in this meeting, we are going to destroy the United States, theoretically, and rebuild it anew under the U.S. Constitution, which might be treason, or which probably was. You're overthrowing a government and then putting in something new. Now, we could argue that we had the consent of the governed. These are our representatives, but the people didn't send them there to build a new constitution. They just sent them there to change the old one. So, was this treason? I don't know. And so some ideas come into play, and one of them is the Virginia Plan, the first general plan for the new Constitution. Laid out some ideas for how our government would come into being, created the executive branch and added a judicial branch, and then we have talked about the legislative branch. So we have an executive, judicial, and legislative branches, but the legislative branch would actually be the legislature. So we already had legislatures under the Articles of Confederation. It was actually the only branch of government that existed. And so this would now create an executive branch and a judicial branch. But under this model, the legislative branch would choose the executive, and the judiciary, which is more like a parliamentary system. It's not a so we have a congressional system, which is our Congress is and Senate are independently elected by the people, and then we have a presidential system as well, where our people through the electoral college elect the president, but there are some changes that are going on here that need to be taken into consideration, and so the this document is going to be very crucial to what we build, but it's not exactly what we have, and this is actually also going to benefit large states. One of the things that the Virginia Plan proposes is that larger states get more representation. Now, New Jersey plan, New Jersey being a small state, Virginia being a large state, Virginia, larger states are going to benefit from a lot of what Virginia plan says. New Jersey plan, small states are going to benefit. Strengthen the Articles of Confederation is really what they want. They say, we really want the Articles of Confederation. The reason why Articles of Confederation benefits smaller states. And then we have but they realize they can't have the Articles of Confederation, so they're in some ways going to try to remake the Articles of Confederation. Unicameral legislature with one vote for each state, with representatives chosen by the state legislatures. Again, give states the control over the national government. A Congress with the ability to raise revenue. Again, pay off those debts. That's hugely important. And a Supreme Court with members appointed for life by the executive. And so, many of the ideas of the Virginia plan and many of the ideas of the New Jersey plan are promoted. And what ends up happening is we're going to do something that our nation is known for in its history, and that's compromise. The two sides are going to battle, and eventually one idea is going to come into play, which is originally known as the Connecticut Plan, but will go down in history as the Great Compromise. One, it's actually going to change how government is structured. It's going to take the power of the national government, which used to lie under the states, and put it at the top. And so the first thing it's going to do is going to make national law supreme. It's going to put an importance on the national government's involvement in the nation's existence, which it didn't have under the Articles of Confederation. And so it was going to create a legislative branch. Well, it's going to say that we have a legislative branch. That legislative branch also will have two chambers, a House of Representatives, which will have proportional representation, which is what Virginia wanted. And so the large states would have more say in the House of Representatives, and the small states would have a lesser say. But we would also have the Senate, where everybody gets equal representation, which is what New Jersey wants. And so both groups are happy. The representation in the House would be determined by would be based on 56 representatives who are elected by the people. Because at this time the House of Representatives is the only branch of Congress, or only section of Congress that is directly elected by the people. It has the ability to originate all types of bills. Our Senate has the ability to originate some types of bills, but our House, and we'll get into that, has the ability to originate all types of bills. And then we have the Senate, again, with equality. Again, smaller states get what they want in the Senate. Larger states get what they want in the House. Both chambers are needed to pass a piece of legislation. Neither body could dominate the other because they're both needed. There is going to be a problem, however. Once these ideas are coming into play, and once we start talking about proportional representation, the question is going to be, are we going to count the slaves? So the slave states say, well, we're going to go by proportional representation, right? And so we would like to count our slaves in our population. And the anti-slave individuals are going to kind of put a timeout. They're going to say, time out. You want to count your slaves as people, but you don't want to treat them as people? And the slave states go, correct. And now there's an argument. And so there's a huge argument, and our country almost dies over the issue of slavery at its beginning in creating at its very early stages in creating the U.S. Constitution. And so there's a negotiation that is had, and in negotiations you battle back and forth, and usually you end up somewhere close to the middle, and that's kind of where we end up. We end up with the 3/5 compromise. If it was really a even split, it would have been the 1/2 compromise. But 3/5 of the person. We're under the Constitution until the time of the end of slavery, and and so on the 13th Amendment and then the 14th Amendment, which for the most part makes slaves citizens. Um, we're going to count slaves as 3/5 of a person. So if you're counting population of a state, it's whole number of free persons plus 3/5 of all other persons. So if you were to go to a plantation and count slaves, it'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's 3. And then when you get to the, you get to the, you get to the end of that plantation, go 1, 2, and you go to the next plantation, 3, 4, 5. That's 3. And at the end of you might have 240,000 and 3/5 of a person. So just be on 240,000 people, and that would be the population. Slaves could not vote, but the larger population a state had, the more say that they had in the House. And this actually is going to be a very interesting development, because the counting of slaves actually gives the southern states, or the slave states, not just the southern states, but the slave states, 47% of the House of Representatives, which is going to give them enough votes to make sure slavery stays an institution for a significant amount of time. The Constitution, again, is going to lay out the idea of federalism. Again, there are certain responsibilities that belong to the national government, and there are certain responsibilities that belong to the state. The national government in the Constitution is laid out with certain responsibilities, and then everything else through is supposed to go to the states through the reserve powers. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. The framers created the division between the national and state power, with national power being supreme. So at the end, the national power is supposed to outweigh the states. In many instances, there are reasons and there are things that the Constitution is given to the states because they're not stated in the Constitution. So in Chapter 3, I'll fledge that out even more. I'll lay out what is national government power. We'll talk about a little bit of that momentarily, and then what is state power. Our Constitution, again, lays out 3 branches of government: our legislative branch, which is the law-making branch; our executive branch, which is the law-enforcing branch; and our judicial branch, which is the law-interpreting, if we say inferring, but the law-interpreting branch. Separately staffed branches of government, which are separated from each other. We also have what is called the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is a part of the government that is mainly made up of non-elected individuals who are responsible for the everyday running of government. And so we have our representatives who represent us and do our legislative part, but government operates as well as a machine that dictates everyday factors of life and everyday instances that are made of everyday employed people to make sure it runs. And so the bureaucracy is actually known and considered to be the 4th unofficial branch of government because of the amount of responsibility it has and how government runs. Now, I've given you actually this PowerPoint in a separate PowerPoint. I like it a lot. Blow it up. It is going to help you with your checks and balances and understanding the powers of each branch. But the checks and balances exist for an important reason. We don't want one branch to dominate the other branches of government. We want them to kind of stay in contention with one another. We want them to exist in a plane of where they have to balance with one another, because it prevents tyranny, and that was what the idea behind the creation of the Constitution would be, and the subsequent amendments would be, is to create that balance. But you have your executive branch, again, the lawmaking branch. But if the lawmakers are doing something out of the realm of what is allowable, you might have the judicial branch to step into the Supreme Court to deem those actions unconstitutional. You also may have the legislative branch deem an action by an executive to be way beyond the bounds of what the executive or a president should do, and they have the ability to impeach in the House of Representatives, which is an indictment, which means there's enough evidence to charge a president with a crime, and then remove that said president through the Senate hearing, which would determine if the president should be able to stay in office or not. And you would need 67 senators to vote to remove a president. So you have the House, which determines the impeachment, and then you have the Senate, which determines the removal. That's the balance between those chambers. And so that's the check on the executive branch. The judicial branch checks where, well, one, the executive chooses the judiciary, and then the legislative branch is the one who controls what the Constitution says. And so if the legislature amends the Constitution and we as the people approve that amendment, what our Supreme Court interprets can change. And so issue over so say we had the Supreme Court rulings over marriage, which made marriage more inclusive and allowed people of same genders to be married to one another. If our Congress had created an amendment that said marriage can only be between a man and a woman, and that was then approved by the states through the ratification, our Supreme Court then could not rule on that case in that way because it removed the power from the Supreme Court to do so, saying because it would have been constitutional to dictate that only marriage can only be between the gender of male and female. So that's that's how that could work. And then we have the check on the legislature. The president signs or vetoes or could pocket veto bills that come into place from the legislative branch. And then the judiciary has a check on the legislative branch through determining the constitutionality of the laws that they create. And so again, that's the check and balance that they all have with one another. Again, making sure that we don't have tyranny in our system. So let's take a look at our Constitution through its articles. Article 1, legislative branch vests all legislative powers in Congress, creates a bicameral legislature. The qualifications for holding office are found in this section. The term of office and the method of selecting the individuals who hold this office come into play. It also lays out the powers of government. If you were to look at the Constitution, actually I have the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution on the wall. Actually, that's the let's see here. The Constitution on the bottom, Declaration of Independence is on top. We have the enumerated some powers that are laid out in this document. And Article 1 is the longest because the powers of the national government reside in Article 1. And the powers that reside, we have the enumerated powers, or we can call them the delegated powers or the stated powers. The powers that are actually expressed to the national government and are written down exist in Article 1 and in Article 1, Section 8. These are 17 specific powers expressly granted to Congress under Article 1, Section 8. The necessary and proper clause exists as well. So we have the powers that are stated, but we're allowed to expand upon those powers in certain instances through the necessary and proper clause. And so to make sure that the powers work, we might expand those to areas that we may not have foreseen before. And one of those, when something that's created out of that expansion, is called an implied power. You can imply that the power exists because it aids one of the first 17. So the national government has the power to create an army and a navy. Well, we've expanded upon that to create the Marines, Air Force, and Coast Guard. So Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard. Yeah, that's again, everybody. And so that would be an implied power. So we've expanded upon the powers of the national government. I'll explain more of that, and I'll reiterate that in Chapter 3. The powers, again, derived from the enumerated powers and the use of the necessary and proper clause. These are known as implied powers. Again, lays out a vast array of powers that the national government has, just found in Article 1, Section 8. Article 2. The authority to execute the laws of the nation in the President of the United States. Lays out the 4-year term. In the beginning, it doesn't say how many 4-year terms. The creation of the Electoral College. And so if you don't like the Electoral College and you don't like that you can win the popular vote without winning you can win the presidency without winning the popular vote, you can change that but you got to amend the Constitution to do so. The qualifications for office and how you can replace a president due to death, disability, and removal, that's been clarified in latter amendments. The State of the Union address, again, orders that the president reports to Congress from time to time to state how the nation is going, and that you as a